At a family dinner, my dad smiled and said, "Your sister's moving in with you next week." I just kept eating. They had no idea I'd moved into a new apartment they didn't even know existed. I, 29M, sat at the dinner table, mechanically chewing my mother's overcooked pot roast while my family chatted around me like nothing had changed. The familiar dining room felt suffocating. Same floral wallpaper, same creaky chairs, same condescending atmosphere I'd grown up despising. Dad cleared his throat and delivered the news with that smug smile of his, telling me how my sister would be moving into my apartment next week after her latest relationship disaster. I nodded and kept eating. They had no idea. 2 months ago, I'd quietly moved into a beautiful one-bedroom apartment across town. Same rent, better neighborhood, actual privacy. My family still thought I lived in that cramped studio downtown where they'd helped me move 3 years ago. The studio I deliberately kept just for moments like this. My sister launched into her usual sob story about her ex-boyfriend and how she just needed a few months to get back on her feet. Mom chimed in with supportive murmurs about families sticking together. Dad explained how I should feel honored to help out, considering everything they'd done for me growing up. The same script they'd been running for years whenever my sister needed something. This was the 4th time in 5 years she'd crashed at my place. Each time lasting longer than promised. Each time leaving my space messier than before. Each time treating me like a free hotel rather than a brother doing her a favor. The last stint had lasted 8 months. 8 months of her bringing random guys over, eating my food, monopolizing my TV, and acting like I was the inconvenience in my own home. But this time would be different. I finished dinner and told them I needed to swing by my apartment to make some space for her arrival. They barely looked up from their dessert, too busy planning my sister's temporary living situation to notice the slight smile creeping across my face. The drive to my old studio felt therapeutic. I'd been maintaining the facade for weeks, paying both rents just for this moment. The cramped space looked exactly how I'd left it, lived in enough to seem authentic, but cleared of anything valuable. I'd strategically left some old clothes, basic toiletries, and cheap furniture to maintain the illusion. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister asking if I had any specific rules for her stay. I typed back that she knew the drill, just keep things clean and respect boundaries. She responded with a heart emoji and promises about how different things would be this time. Sure they would. The weekend arrived faster than expected. My sister showed up at the studio with 2 large suitcases and that familiar expectant smile. She commented on how the place looked exactly the same, which wasn't surprising since I'd deliberately kept it frozen in time. I helped her carry her bags upstairs, playing the role of the accommodating brother perfectly. She immediately began rearranging furniture to better suit her needs, pushing my desk into a corner to make room for her makeup station. I watched her transform my supposed living space into her personal domain, just like always. The entitlement was breathtaking. Within an hour, she'd claimed the prime real estate near the windows and started talking about having some friends over later in the week. I told her I had some work errands to run and would be back later. She waved me off without looking up from her unpacking, already making herself completely at home. Perfect. My real apartment felt like a sanctuary when I walked through the door. Clean, organized, quiet, everything the studio wasn't. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and the satisfaction was even sweeter than I'd imagined. My sister was settling into her new temporary home, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd be sleeping in luxury while she thought I was crashing on friends' couches to give her privacy. The first week played out predictably. My sister texted constant updates about her job search and complaints about the studio's quirks. She grumbled about the noisy neighbors, the broken garbage disposal, and the weird smell in the hallway. All genuine issues I'd been dealing with for years. I responded with sympathetic messages while lounging on my actual couch in my quiet, well-maintained building. She started bringing friends over by day 3, just as expected. The studio became a revolving door of her social circle, people I'd specifically moved away from. They treated the place like a crash pad, leaving messes and assuming I'd handle the cleanup whenever I returned home. My sister sent apologetic texts about the temporary chaos, promising things would settle down soon. Meanwhile, I was thriving. My real routine remained undisturbed. Morning coffee on my balcony, peaceful evenings without unexpected visitors, actual control over my living space. The dual existence felt liberating rather than exhausting. I'd pop by the studio every few days to maintain appearances, usually when I knew she'd be out job hunting or socializing. During these visits, I'd survey the damage and document everything with photos. The kitchen sink filled with her dirty dishes, her clothes scattered across every surface, mystery stains on my old couch, empty food containers she'd promised to replace, the bathroom counter claimed entirely by her beauty products. Each photo was evidence of why I'd needed to escape this pattern. Week 2 brought the inevitable escalation. My sister informed me she'd started dating someone new and asked if he could stay over occasionally. I agreed with fake reluctance, knowing I wouldn't be there to witness the awkwardness. Her new boyfriend turned out to be a loud, inconsiderate type who treated my studio like his personal man cave. They stayed up late watching action movies at full volume. He left beer cans throughout the apartment and never replaced anything he consumed. My sister apologized for his behavior, but made no real effort to curb it. The neighbor complaints started rolling in, forwarded to me through angry voicemails and threatening notes. I played the frustrated roommate perfectly, expressing annoyance through text while secretly celebrating every new mess. Each boundary crossed was another nail in the coffin of my family's assumption that I'd always be available for their convenience. The documentation grew more damning by the day. The turning point came during week 3. My sister threw an impromptu party while I was supposedly at work late. 20 people crammed into my tiny studio, music blasting until 2 a.m., neighbors calling the police for noise violations. I received the angry call from my landlord while sitting peacefully in my real home, genuinely shocked by the scale of destruction described. When I returned the next morning, the studio looked like a crime scene. Broken furniture, stains on the carpet, damage that would definitely cost my security deposit. My sister was hungover and defensive, claiming the party had gotten out of hand despite her best efforts. Her boyfriend was passed out on my couch, surrounded by empty bottles and food containers. This was my moment. I took extensive photos of everything, then sat down with my sister for a serious conversation. I explained how disappointed I was, how this behavior was exactly what I'd feared when she moved in. She became tearful and apologetic, promising to clean everything up and pay for damages. Her boyfriend mumbled half-hearted apologies while nursing his hangover, but I was done playing along. I told them both they needed to find alternative arrangements within the week. My sister exploded, accusing me of being unreasonable and uncaring. She reminded me of all the times family had helped me out, how I owed her this support. Her boyfriend chimed in with comments about my selfishness and lack of loyalty. I remained calm throughout their emotional manipulation, knowing I held all the cards. When they demanded to know where I'd be staying since I was kicking them out of my place, I delivered the line I'd been rehearsing for months. I told them I'd figure something out, maybe crash with friends or find a new place entirely. The irony was delicious. They were concerned about displacing me from an apartment I hadn't actually lived in for months. My sister grudgingly agreed to start looking for alternatives, muttering about my sudden change in attitude. Update 1. The following week brought exactly the chaos I'd anticipated. My sister scrambled to find new accommodations while simultaneously trying to guilt me into changing my mind. She enlisted our parents as reinforcements, leading to several uncomfortable phone calls where they questioned my sudden inability to help family in need. Dad was particularly harsh, reminding me of my obligations as the older brother and questioning what had changed about my character recently. Mom took a gentler approach, suggesting I was being too harsh and that everyone deserved second chances. Neither of them asked about the specifics of what had driven me to this decision. They simply assumed I was being unreasonably difficult. I played my role perfectly, expressing regret about the situation while standing firm on my boundaries. I explained how the party had been the final straw, how I couldn't risk further damage to my relationship with my landlord. When pressed about where I'd be living, I maintained the fiction that I was exploring options with friends. My sister's boyfriend disappeared after the first few days of apartment hunting, apparently unwilling to deal with the complications of finding legitimate housing. His departure triggered another emotional breakdown from my sister, who accused me of ruining her relationship through my unreasonable demands. The victim mentality was exhausting, even from a distance. She eventually found a room in a shared house across town, but not without plenty of drama about the cramped conditions and questionable roommates. The move-out day was particularly satisfying. I helped load her belongings while she complained about having to settle for substandard accommodations. She made several comments about how much nicer my studio was compared to her new situation, completely unaware that I'd been living somewhere even better all along. The damage assessment confirmed my worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. The security deposit was forfeit, and I owed an additional $800 in repairs. The landlord was understanding but firm about the consequences of the party damage. I paid everything without complaint, treating it as the cost of my elaborate deception. Update 2. 3 weeks after my sister moved out, I decided it was time for the next phase. I'd been maintaining radio silence about my living situation, deflecting family questions with vague references to staying with friends. The mystery was clearly bothering them, especially my parents, who'd grown accustomed to knowing every detail of my life. During our next family dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to my housing situation. Mom expressed concern about my stability, wondering aloud whether I was handling adult responsibilities appropriately. Dad suggested I should start looking for a proper apartment instead of imposing on friends indefinitely. My sister, still bitter about her eviction, made snide comments about my apparent inability to maintain consistent living arrangements. I listened to their concerns with practiced patience, occasionally nodding or offering non-committal responses. They had no idea they were describing problems I'd already solved months ago. The irony was becoming increasingly difficult to contain, but I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. The breakthrough came when my sister mentioned struggling with her new living situation. Her roommates were inconsiderate, the neighborhood felt unsafe, and she was paying more rent for significantly less space. She hinted strongly about wanting to reconcile, suggesting we could both benefit from finding a place together where we'd share expenses and responsibilities. Dad jumped on this suggestion immediately, proposing it as the perfect solution to both our housing problems. Mom agreed enthusiastically, painting rosy pictures of sibling bonding and mutual support. They began planning our reunion before either of us had agreed to anything, completely steamrolling over any potential objections. My sister watched my face carefully during this family intervention, probably expecting resistance. Instead, I surprised everyone by appearing to consider the proposal seriously. I mentioned being tired of the uncertainty and admitting that shared expenses would be financially beneficial. The relief around the table was palpable. They thought they'd successfully manipulated me back into their preferred arrangement. But I had different plans entirely. I agreed to start looking at apartments with my sister, but insisted we find something significantly nicer than my previous studio. I claimed that recent work developments had improved my financial situation, making better housing options possible. My family was delighted by this apparent maturation in my priorities and decision-making. The apartment hunting process was enlightening. My sister consistently gravitated toward places that would primarily benefit her: great social locations, spaces designed more for entertaining than comfortable living, layouts that would give her the master bedroom by default. She clearly expected to resume the same dynamic we'd had before, just in a nicer setting. I played along enthusiastically, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions while privately knowing none of this mattered. We scheduled several viewings over 2 weeks, building anticipation for our new shared living arrangement. My sister grew increasingly excited about the prospect, already planning how she'd decorate and what friends she'd invite over. The family pressure intensified as our search progressed. Sunday dinners became planning sessions where everyone contributed opinions about neighborhoods, lease terms, and furniture arrangements. They treated my housing situation like a community project, completely invested in the outcome. The level of involvement would have been suffocating if I'd actually needed their input. During this time, I also started dropping subtle hints about having learned valuable lessons from our previous living arrangement. I mentioned implementing new boundaries and expectations for any future cohabitation. My sister interpreted these as reasonable compromises, evidence that I'd grown from the experience rather than warning signs of impending consequences. Update 3. The revelation came on a Sunday evening, perfectly orchestrated for maximum impact. We'd just finished another family dinner where the conversation had centered entirely on mine and my sister's apartment search. Everyone was invested in our progress, offering advice and expressing excitement about our impending reunion. My sister had found what she considered the perfect place, a spacious 2-bedroom with modern amenities in a trendy neighborhood. The rent was steep but manageable with both our incomes, and she'd already started talking about move-in dates and utility arrangements. My parents were thrilled with her choice, praising her practical thinking and mature approach to the housing search. I waited until everyone had settled into dessert and coffee before making my announcement. The timing was crucial. I needed their full attention and minimal opportunity for immediate escape. I began by expressing appreciation for everyone's concern about my living situation over the past few months. Then I told them the truth. I explained that I'd been living in a beautiful one-bedroom apartment across town for the past 4 months. The same apartment I was currently paying rent on, sleeping in every night, and had never actually moved out of. I described its amenities, location, and how much I'd been enjoying the peace and privacy it provided. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister was the first to react, demanding to know why I'd lied about my living situation. Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing anger as the implications began sinking in. She asked where I'd actually been staying during her time at the studio, and I calmly explained that I'd been home every night in my comfortable bed. Dad's face went through several color changes as he processed the deception. He asked why I'd gone through such an elaborate charade instead of simply telling the truth from the beginning. I explained that I needed to know whether my family would respect my boundaries and decisions, or simply steamroll over them, as they'd done consistently throughout my adult life. Mom tried to play peacemaker, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. But I continued my explanation, detailing how I deliberately maintained the studio specifically to avoid the exact situation they'd forced on me. How I'd known my sister would inevitably need somewhere to stay, and I'd wanted to provide help without sacrificing my own comfort. My sister's anger erupted as she realized the full scope of my deception. She accused me of manipulation and cruelty, pointing out how she'd struggled with guilt about displacing me from my home. I acknowledged her feelings while noting that she'd never actually asked about my comfort or well-being during her stay. She'd simply assumed my accommodation was her right. The conversation devolved into accusations and defensive justifications. Dad was furious about being lied to, treating my deception as a betrayal of family trust. Mom kept trying to find compromise solutions, unable to accept that I'd deliberately created this situation. My sister fluctuated between hurt and rage, alternately playing victim and launching attacks on my character. But I remained calm throughout the storm. I explained that this had been a necessary test of whether they viewed me as an autonomous adult or simply a resource to be utilized when convenient. Their reaction to learning about my apartment proved which category I fell into. Rather than respecting my right to privacy and independent decision-making, they were angry about losing access to control my living situation. The evening ended with my sister storming out and my parents demanding time to process what they'd learned. I cleaned up dessert dishes in peaceful silence, finally free from the exhausting performance I'd been maintaining for months. The aftermath was predictably dramatic. My sister sent a series of angry texts accusing me of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. She claimed I'd damaged our relationship irreparably and that she'd never be able to trust me again. The irony of her complaints about dishonesty and boundary violations was apparently lost on her entirely. My parents called the next day requesting a family meeting to discuss my behavior and find a path forward. Dad was particularly insistent that my actions required serious examination and potential consequences. I agreed to the meeting, knowing it would provide the perfect opportunity to address the fundamental issues my experiment had exposed. The conversation was enlightening for everyone involved. Under pressure to explain their anger, my family gradually revealed their true expectations. They believed I should prioritize family needs over personal comfort, that my resources should be available when required, and that privacy was a luxury I shouldn't expect while family members needed support. I listened to their arguments carefully, then presented my counterposition. I explained that healthy adult relationships require mutual respect, clear boundaries, and voluntary rather than coerced generosity. I'd spent years accommodating family demands at my own expense, and the apartment situation had simply been the latest example of expected sacrifice. The studio arrangement had proven that my concerns were valid. My sister had immediately claimed my space as her own, shown no consideration for my comfort, caused property damage through her negligence, and expressed no genuine gratitude for the accommodation provided. The experience had confirmed that my family viewed my assistance as an obligation rather than a gift. Most importantly, their reaction to learning about my actual living situation revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. Instead of happiness that I'd found stable, comfortable housing, they were angry about being deceived. Instead of respecting my right to make independent decisions about my living space, they felt entitled to information and access I'd chosen to withhold. The meeting ended without resolution, but with much clearer understanding of our different perspectives. My parents left frustrated by my unwillingness to apologize for my deception. My sister maintained her position that I'd acted maliciously and selfishly. I felt satisfied that I'd finally established boundaries that would protect my well-being going forward. Over the following weeks, our family dynamic shifted dramatically. Sunday dinners became optional rather than assumed obligations. Requests for assistance came with actual questions rather than presumed acceptance. My sister found alternative housing arrangements without involving me in the process. The apartment search we'd conducted together was quietly abandoned. She eventually found a place she could afford independently, though not without several comments about how much easier things would have been with my cooperation. I wished her well in her new home while maintaining firm boundaries about future cohabitation arrangements. My parents gradually accepted the new reality, though not without periodic attempts to guilt me back into my previous role. They continued believing I'd handled the situation poorly, but couldn't argue with the effectiveness of my approach. For the first time in years, they asked before assuming my availability and resources. The revenge had been perfect precisely because it wasn't vindictive, it was educational. Rather than simply punishing my family for their assumptions, I'd created a situation that forced everyone to confront the unhealthy dynamics we'd been perpetuating. The apartment deception had served as a mirror, reflecting back their true expectations and attitudes in ways that couldn't be denied or rationalized away. 6 months later, our relationships had stabilized into something more honest and respectful. My sister and I maintained cordial contact, though with much clearer boundaries about expectations and obligations. My parents treated me more like an adult peer rather than a resource to be managed. Family gatherings became genuinely pleasant rather than strategic planning sessions for my next sacrifice. The financial cost of maintaining 2 apartments for those crucial months had been significant, but the investment had paid dividends in personal freedom and family respect. I'd proven to myself and everyone else that I was capable of making independent decisions and enforcing reasonable boundaries. The elaborate deception had been necessary precisely because straightforward communication had failed repeatedly in the past. Looking back, I recognize that the situation could have been handled differently. More direct confrontation, clearer boundary setting, or simply refusing to help might have achieved similar results. But none of those approaches would have provided the definitive proof that the apartment experiment had delivered. Sometimes dramatic action is necessary to break entrenched patterns and create space for healthier dynamics. The studio apartment served its purpose perfectly and was eventually converted back into a legitimate residence for someone who actually needed it. My sister learned to manage her housing crises independently, developing resilience and problem-solving skills she'd never needed while relying on family bailouts. My parents gained respect for my autonomy and decision-making capabilities they'd previously questioned. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed control over my living situation and established precedents for future interactions. The apartment deception had been the foundation for rebuilding family relationships on more equitable terms, where generosity was voluntary rather than expected, and where my comfort and boundaries carried the same weight as everyone else's needs. The revenge had been subtle, educational, and ultimately constructive, exactly what the situation required.